It's the start of the new year, and as I always do, I'm now going to do my top 5 favorite books that I read last year in 2025. I have done full-length reviews for all of the books that I'm about to talk about here, so if you want to hear more detail about the books I'm mentioning, then seek those reviews out. I'll link them in the description. But anyway, let's get right into the list. Number 5 is These Truths, A History of the United States by Jill Lepore. This is a 900-page mammoth on American history, from Christopher Columbus all the way to Donald Trump's first term. I went into it expecting it to be very brisk. The reason I read it was because I wanted a good, solid overview of the entire history of the United States, so that I could then pick and choose which periods interested me the most for future reading or whatever. The approach this book tries to take is to look at the United States from a pretty socially conscious perspective. Of course, you're getting into all of the conventional stuff with the founding fathers, but you're also looking at sort of the marginalized, the underclasses, trying to find equality in a land that promises it, but always seems to dangle those promises over people's heads. So it does have this critical lens that is painting Jill Lepore's perspective, and a lot of the time the book does a good job at highlighting social inequities that are sort of woven into American history. There are other times, though, where Jill Lepore's insight kind of falls off, and this tends to happen towards the end of the book, where she shifts away from history to sort of political commentary and current events. So I definitely had issues as it went on, where it seemed to sort of lose focus and get very scattershot, talking about every single issue under the sun, whereas the earlier chapters had a very strong narrative and a really good way at illustrating the points Jill Lepore was making. So at the end of the day, it's a mixed bag, but I still got a lot out of this. It really got me amped up to read more about American history, especially critical American history. So, it's not perfect, but it does a great job as an introduction to the subject. Number 4 is A Grain of Wheat by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi wa Thiong'o was a very famous African author from Kenya who died just last year, so I thought I should pick up another of his novels and give him another chance. I had previously read Devil on the Cross, and while I thought it was decent, I had a few issues with it, not least of which was that it had a very simplistic way of depicting the good guys versus the bad guys. It was very black and white, but A Grain of Wheat basks in shades of gray. It was written just a couple years after Kenya finally gained its independence after 7 years of violent conflict against their imperialist British oppressors. So the country was in disarray, not really sure what the future held, and everyone was still struggling with the fact that they had either done terrible things, their family might have been ripped apart by the divide of this conflict, things like that. So the book really lingers on this by focusing on several interweaving characters whose stories come together through a series of flashbacks. The book is set just on the eve of Kenya officially gaining its independence on a particular date. There's going to be a huge celebration, but the characters are kind of reflecting back on their life during the conflict, and slowly you're getting these revelations about them, showing that they're not quite what they seem. There's a main character named Mugo who is kind of a local hero in his village, but he's traumatized. He knows he's done a lot of bad stuff that doesn't make him quite the hero that everyone else makes him out to be, so he doesn't want to participate in the celebration. And over the course of the story, you find out why. There's a lot of slice of life of village life, like before the conflict, during, and after the conflict. There's a lot of love triangles, a lot of coming-of-age themes, and of course a lot of stuff about like anti-imperialism and Kenyan nationality, all weaved together in a very deft way. The first 50 pages or so are quite difficult to get into. You're getting introduced to way too much at once, way too many characters, but once you start getting into the flashbacks, you sort of settle into the story, and it really grew on me. Out of the few African novels that I've read, A Grain of Wheat turned out to be my favorite, so I would say if you're curious about reading African literature, out of the books I've read, I would say A Grain of Wheat is a good place to start. Number 3 is Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. This is a pretty famous Russian science fiction novel, which was written during the Cold War in the Soviet Union. And if you know anything about the Soviet Union at all, you know that they are notorious for censoring their books. So for a long time, the only novel version you could find of this in English was a heavily censored version. But in 2011, a uncensored version came out, so be sure you get that version if you read this book. And anyway, it's about this future where these aliens visited Earth at several points on the globe and then immediately left. But they left behind all of these strange artifacts, and they seem to radiate this very dangerous power. So the government has set up perimeters around each of these zones so that they can officially experiment and test the things that the aliens left behind. But there's a black market, and these people called stalkers go into the zone illegally to steal these objects and then sell them on the black market. So this is incredibly dangerous work. It involves a lot of exploitation since the stalkers are middlemen for this black market. And into this story we follow Red, who is this stalker who's been doing it for years. He's very jaded and nihilistic. At the start of the book, we're given this very gritty first-person perspective. He's an alcoholic, he doesn't like people, he wants to provide for his family, but he's grown distant from them because of his very dangerous work. So the book has a lot going for it in terms of social commentary about exploitation and poverty and addiction, wanting to make the world better but having no means to do it. It's written in 4 pretty long chapters. Each chapter almost feels like its own self-contained story, even though it does build up in a conventional way that a novel would. So some of these chapters are hit and miss. The first and final chapters are fantastic, but the 3rd chapter just jumps totally away from Red, and I found myself really getting sort of lost and losing interest. There's also some rough stuff in the prose. It's written kind of like an American hard-boiled pulp detective novel. Sometimes that works really well for it, other times not so much. But despite these rough points, I thought this was a really interesting book with a lot of really cool and disturbing and creepy concepts. Brilliant atmosphere, especially in the zone. It felt like this sort of Lovecraftian horror at times, especially at that unforgettable climax. It's definitely not a perfect novel by any means, but it's super interesting and I would recommend giving it a shot. Number 2 is The Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson. If you had told me when I picked up this massive, exhaustive, dry history book of the English Industrial Revolution that it would end up being in my top 5 for the year, I would have thought you were crazy, because this was the most difficult nonfiction book that I have ever read. The first few chapters were especially frustrating because as E.P. Thompson is setting up all of these moving pieces that would eventually culminate in this radical workers' sentiment against the Industrial Revolution, he's just throwing all of these movements and philosophies and religions and political figures at you at blinding speed, and he's presuming that you know exactly what he's talking about, so he rarely bothers to explain it. Even though I already knew a sort of overview of this period, I still found myself absolutely treading water until he sort of leaves the setup pieces behind, and in chapter 4 or 5 he switches gears to being a lot more narrative, explaining things to you, and that's where I started to get absolutely riveted, as he examines the ways in which the working class was exploited by the Industrial Revolution. There was no working class to start with. It was just a peasant class who was ripped out of their ancestral way of life, their traditional way of working and making a living, and shoved into these factories where suddenly they were under the corporate watch, they were being exploited around every corner. Children were sent to work in these incredibly dangerous factories away from their parents. Just an absolutely untenable situation where a lot of communities ended up becoming absolutely devastated, dealing with things like starvation and disease in communities that had never faced it before, just because of the awful working conditions. And so you slowly see this bubbling of frustration coming up, especially as the French Revolution happens just across the English Channel, and suddenly these workers are just like, oh, we can throw off our oppressors and guillotine them if we want to. So the upper class in England starts freaking the fuck out and cracking down hard. If you even speak of pushing for your rights as a worker, of collectivizing or unionizing, it could mean your death. So it starts getting very intense as these workers are having like these midnight meetings out in the middle of a field and swearing like these blood oaths in front of representations of death. And of course, like I said, it was really difficult. I found myself often feeling like I wasn't getting everything I could out of this book just because I wasn't as aware and educated on this period as I could have been, or as educated on political theory or critical theory. Very influential book, very difficult, very trying, but so rewarding. I learned so much about collective action, about protest, how to do it successfully, how to organize. It was really inspiring, and yeah, I'm glad that I read it, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to read it again. I would like to read more critical theory though, so that if I do encounter another book like this, I'll be a little bit more prepared. And my favorite book that I read in 2025 was The Odyssey by Homer. I had read The Odyssey many years ago. It was an old prose translation, but this year I wanted to read both of Homer's epic poems back to back with Emily Wilson's new verse translations, and I really got a lot out of it, especially when I revisited the Odyssey. So of course the Odyssey is about Odysseus and his journey back home after fighting the Trojan War and being held hostage by the goddess Calypso. His family doesn't know what happened to him, so the son, Telemachus, sets out to try and find out what happened to the father. It's paced a lot like a modern adventure novel where it's, you know, a little bit slow to get going, but then you switch to Odysseus' perspective and it really gets into the high adventure stuff that everyone knows this story for, where he's fighting monsters and dealing with the gods, and there's a lot of humor, there's a lot of wit, there's suspense. It's just a really cool story, and it's incredible how even though it's 3,000 pages, 3,000 years old, it just leaps off the page at you. So I know a lot of people hear something like the Odyssey and how old it is, and they're instantly intimidated. But I'm begging you not to be, and to give it a try if you haven't read it before, because it's very easy language, you can pick it up, you don't need to know everything about Greek heroes or folklore to understand what's going on. Homer does throw a lot of references to other Greek figures and myths at you, but it's in such a way that if you don't get it, it'll roll right off your back because the story itself is just so much fun and engaging once you get into it, once it picks up and stuff. The first time I read the Odyssey, it was basically my introduction to Greek literature, as it is for many people. But this time, I had read a lot of the stories that Homer is referencing. So when he's talking about Agamemnon and drawing a parallel with Odysseus, I totally understood what was being communicated. So moments like that really elevated the work for me. There were parts that I didn't enjoy so much the first time, where I really got a lot out of it this time. I would say if you're interested in reading Homer, just pick up the Odyssey and just see how you do. It, like I said, it takes a little bit to get going, but once you switch over from Telemachus to Odysseus, I feel like most people just fall right into the story, and it doesn't let them go until the very bloody, intense climax at the end. There's so many iconic encounters with the Cyclops and the Sirens and Scylla and Charybdis. All of this is going to stay in your memory long after you've read it. So if you haven't read the Odyssey, read the Odyssey. There you have it, my top 5 reads of 2025. I don't mean to pour cold water on myself here, but I will just say that this was not my best year for reading in terms of the enjoyment I got out of these books. As you probably noticed, the first few books I mentioned in this list, I couldn't help but mention some of the flaws in them that I had problems with. So while I didn't exactly get any 5-star reads out of 2025, I still think the books that I mentioned are worth looking into, especially if it's something you've never heard about before, because it's always good to broaden your horizons, and I hope that I've been able to do that for you in this video. And now you can do that for me by telling me what your favorite books of 2025 were. What kind of books are you looking forward to reading in the new year as well? I'm still trying to work my way through all of the unread books that I own, so look forward to more history and classics because that's what I've got a lot of. And I'm also going to be looking into a lot of sort of lighter novels, pulp novels, genre fiction as well in the new year, so look forward to that. Thank you for watching, Happy New Year's, and goodbye!